video discussing functional contextualism and factor analysis. Psychology as a discipline, I worry that when I was practicing as a therapist, people got the wrong idea about me. When you're a psych, there's the way it's sort of seen as a counseling role is that this is meant to be some wise person who knows the answers to things, they understand human nature really well, whatever. In reality, 2/3 of the work that you do as a psych is just facilitating an intervention which someone else has come up with. You don't need to live by the rules of that intervention. You just need to be able to present it. And I got a lot out of playing Dungeons and Dragons when I was younger, and running games in Dungeons and Dragons and similar things like that, where I had to do a lot of improv and had to, on the fly come up with a story or implement something that someone else came up with as a series of monsters or characters which were written in the books, in the storybooks that we used to facilitate these games. And that was a really useful transferable set of skills to me. But outside of that, I want to discuss ways that I've viewed human nature, where I do believe that through the process of studying psychology, that the way I view things has changed in a useful way. And this might be something which I can pass on to other people as a way to more deeply understand human nature. Now, there's when I think my view of people properly changed and the way I understand the world became more deeply was in a way which was not trivial and probably more different to most psychologists, is when I did my honours thesis, which involved a factor analysis. Now, my thesis was honestly quite mediocre. It wasn't the thing I was working on most at the time. At the time, I was more interested in playing politics at the university and doing actual work to help people in the community. But if I'm honest, the topic of my thesis was very boring. It was in training evaluation and using, and whilst there was the wider scope of training evaluation which I got to study, my thesis primarily focused on how to properly interpret trainee feedback. It's a very niche thing. No one wakes up in the morning excited about it. But what was exciting, bizarrely enough, was the statistical methods that I used. And the statistical method I used is something called factor analysis. Now, a factor in statistics is a variable that explains multiple other variables. So we might have 100 questions on a survey, and we find out that these 100 questions are actually measuring 2 or 3 things. And we call those factors. A more physical example would be if we had an instrument such as a solar panel, and a thermometer, and we put them out in the sun, and then we had something else which was like, say, a fan, and we'd measure the inputs coming from them. So the thermometer would go up, the solar panel would generate electricity which would go up, and the fan, it wouldn't do anything. So from that we would realize that the solar panel and the thermometer are measuring energy from the sun, and that is what we would call the factor. So the electricity is objectively a different thing. The contents of the thermometer are objectively a different thing, but they're still related to this one variable, which is energy from the sun. And that's what a factor is. And from this approach, I kind of learned that really, and really reflecting on it, that first of all, our initial perceptions of things, they're not usually accurate. Reality is so much deeper, including psychological reality, to anything that we can have a first impression of. And we need complex statistical methods to understand it. Factor analysis is something which takes a little while to understand, and it's not a natural way to think of things. If you look at the mathematical proofs for it, they kind of do your head in, and I didn't need to understand that, thankfully, because I got the computer to do the maths for me. The other side of things is that I started seeing the world in the form of forces rather than actions. So someone might, it's factor analysis facilitated what I call a way that I see things that I call naive functional contextualism. So I didn't understand what functional contextualism was at this time, but I started seeing the world in the form of functional contextualism. So functional contextualism is the idea that whether something is good or bad, or like, say, a chair with 3 legs. This is an example that Russell Harris uses in his book, Act Made Simple, which I recommend as reading for anyone who studies psychology, or because it not only describes a method, but it describes the background behind the method particularly well. Returning to my introspection. Now, this process, so there's a chair with 3 legs. We say, is this chair a bad chair or not? Well, like, if we look at it, what we usually see a chair having the purpose of, we see it as a 4-legged thing which allows us to sit down on. But this chair doesn't exist for that purpose. This chair might be a prop on a stage for a comedy festival, and the idea is that the comedian sits down on it and it falls over. That's funny. So in that way, it serves its purpose. And the same way, factors have this same kind of interaction. They tend to be like when we're doing a measurement in psychology, it's always directional. There are in physics they have scalar and vector variables. So a vector variable would be velocity, so how fast something is going in a particular direction if you're going to try and measure it. Similarly, we only get measurements in factors when we have directions to it. And similarly with like, say, like, you know, with the sun, the energy going up or not, there has to be like it's directional. It's not something which exists in and of itself, such as mass, which is something which exists regardless. Mass and weight are different things. Mass is what's called a scalar vector. It exists without direction. It just exists because you're measuring a physical thing. It's very straightforward. But everything that a human does is related to the direction it takes. And similarly with relational frame theory, whether something is fulfilling its like a role or not depends on how we're using it. And from that I started seeing human behavior as being more structured around a trend. So for example, one time in a workplace, I believed that all my colleagues were, like, a person's behavior had resulted in me being marginalized by the community. And if I was to tell someone that, like, they'd see it as a point of blame, a point of me assigning to this individual a series maladaptive behavior, or in a mechanistic sense. But really, and that they'd plotted to do something, and there's all these other things that people tend to think of, like, you know, this plotting and scheming. It comes from our culture, which is historically is honestly not very enlightened, and we tend to see things from we tend to prescribe so much more agency to people's actions and behaviors rather than just a direction of psychological phenomena. At the simplest way to describe this is that, well, your thoughts, is to ask the question, what is a thought before it's a thought? I don't know what thought's going to pop into my head next. The next thing which gets acted on is going to be acted on by another process that I don't understand, some consciousness understanding the thoughts in my head. And we see this very clearly if we say put a bullet in someone's head, or we perform a lobotomy, the way that they're going to function is going to change. So there tends to be this because of our culture, this egotistic, we tend to assign people an ego, and that ego is doing something which is adaptive or maladaptive, or something that the community doesn't like. This is why we get very judgmental at people. We try and punish them for long periods of time in prison rather than thinking, how do we adjust this person's behavior so they don't harm the community so much? Anyway, that's historically been the case. And yeah, that's my first draft take of describing how studying factor analysis changed how I viewed people. It's also something that most people who train psychology don't often miss the lessons of. A lot of people want to find a place where they can sit in judgment over others. And it's tempting to think that after you spend a large amount of time at university, you're going to be able to put everyone into little categories that you can sort of, define and understand. There's a temptation because through this process of measurement to start quantifying people. And whilst you can certainly quantify people, take all sorts of measurements, those measurements, whatever variable you're measuring it serves in relationship to something else, because there are no real scalar variables in psychology. Everything is a vector. At least everything I've come across. I'm still developing my understanding. Maybe a year from now I'll have a different idea on this.